Hello, and welcome to the Full Circle Healing Podcast, where we merge modern, cutting-edge science with traditional healing wisdom and everything in between to help you come full circle back to your original, natural state of health and well-being. I'm your host, Michael, and over the past 15 years, I've helped hundreds of thousands of people find the information, practices, tools, resources, and experts they needed to find their way back to optimal health. Our guest in this episode is my friend and colleague, Alex Manos. Alex and I share a very similar path and similar interests, including breathwork and psychedelics. So it's always a pleasure to connect and learn from him. Alex is a certified functional medicine practitioner, having studied with the Institute of Functional Medicine. He also holds a master's degree in personalized nutrition. Alex is a certified breathworker and certified psychedelic practitioner, having been in the inaugural cohort of the Synthesis Institute Practitioner Program. He works one-on-one with clients, and over the last few years has worked primarily with those suffering from mold-related illnesses. Away from clinic, Alex is the co-founder of HealthPath, a company that offers functional testing direct to the consumer with user-friendly interpretations of results and personalized health plans, and CWO of Exhale Coffee, the UK's healthiest coffee source. In this episode, you're going to learn how to cultivate resilience in all areas of life, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual, to improve overall well-being and long-term health. You'll learn the importance of community and connection in the healing process and how these can act as powerful catalysts for recovery. You'll learn why self-awareness, compassion, and acceptance are critical elements in the healing process and how they can transform your overall health. And you'll learn practical steps for cultivating resilience through lifestyle changes, mindfulness practices, and integrating healing techniques that work for you, and a ton more. This is a very interesting and truth-filled conversation about what resilience and healing really mean. Something that came up a few times was the state of the nervous system and breathing. If these topics interest you, head over and grab my Breathing for Nervous System Regulation ebook at rebelhealth.co/breathing and start some simple practices today. Now let's go down the rabbit hole with Alex. And we are live with another episode. Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to connect again.
Yeah, likewise. And I'd say welcome back, but we were on some other show in another lifetime in another world. And this is your first appearance here on Full Circle Healing Podcast, our new show. And I think that you're exactly the type of person that I envisioned talking with on this podcast when I decided to create it. The full circle, meaning covering all sides or aspects of building health, or as you like to use the term, resiliency. So let's just jump right in. And I think resiliency is a term that listeners in this functional health world are hearing more frequently from different types of practitioners or teachers, educators at this point, but maybe aren't sure exactly what it means in regards to different aspects of their health. And for today's topic, I'd love to dive into that a little bit. And I guess we could start with physical resiliency, because that's probably the one that they're most familiar with. And then we'll kind of go into the mental, emotional, spiritual side of things from there. Is that all right?
Yeah, of course. I think it's quite tricky to talk about. I think most people would have heard a definition of resilience, this idea of being able to bounce back from an adverse event, a stressor of some kind. And that is by far the most frequently used definition, I think. But it's so much more than that, ultimately. And I think it does it a disservice to think that it's just about your ability to bounce back. While that is true, there are going to be times in our lives when actually we're not going to be able just to bounce back to a baseline. And I think that's just one example whereby there's some real challenges as coming up with just one definition. But I think for me, physical resilience is related from a nervous system perspective in particular to what people talk about as that window of tolerance, and what is your capacity to sit with stresses ultimately. So it is related to coming back to baseline, but it can be much more nuanced than that as well. So within physical resilience, we could talk about microbiome resilience, for example, which is this idea of being able to return to a healthy symbiotic state, let's say after a course of antibiotics, for example. And then you've also got terms like resistance within the microbiome literature, whereby we're talking about how much stressor, how much of a perturbation does it take to actually take the microbiome away from that eubiosis or symbiosis healthy state before actually you're even challenging resilience. So there's lots of finer details to this as well. But for me, it is the capacity to successfully navigate through a stressor and be able to return back to that healthy physiological state. And that's where, you know, we can talk about different elements of our physiology within that ultimately as well.
Sure. I think, great. Thank you for the starter definition. I think, you know, would this apply to, you know, there's a group of people, say there's a group of people traveling together, and traveling is exhausting. You might miss a little sleep. You switch time zones. You're exposed to lots of people, lots of environments with lots of various things going on, lots of exposures, maybe different food than you're used to eating, or different timing of the food, different nature exposure, light exposure. And say there's 3 or 4 people in this group, and 1 or 2 of them get really run down and sick, and a couple other ones maybe just don't feel they're optimal, but they're able to kind of get through that and adjust to the new place. Like, would that be... Having just traveled, this is one that's on the top of my mind. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, definitely. You know, an example given in some of the literature is you're at a dinner party, you're all eating the same food. Some of you come down with food poisoning, others don't. Those with a more resilient microbiome are going to be the ones that don't essentially develop a sickness as a result of that exposure. So, you know, there's that buffer there as a result of diversity within the microbiome. But, you know, this is such a nuanced topic, because you also, I don't think, can talk in some ways about someone's resilience without actually knowing what their values are. So, you know, resilience is as much a sort of biological thing as it is a behavioral thing. So, you know, we sometimes, I think, can merge the concepts of resilience with, for example, grit, which is a slightly different concept ultimately. And there are different requirements in different scenarios. So just to give another example, an athlete who's trying to achieve a specific physical objective, the resilience they require is going to be very different to the resilience required by someone, I don't know, new parents, where there needs to be more fluidity and flexibility, and then maybe the ability to actually say, no, I'm going to have to say no to this. I'm not just going to grit my teeth and have a strategy to get to the outcome, because actually I need to be able to adapt to what's going on in my day. So it is really nuanced, I think, the concept of resilience, and therefore what the definition might be.
The new parent one, I get it. There's a lot of things I've said no to in the last year that I probably would have otherwise done. And I think I've done a good job of not, I don't know if it's by choice, but not pushing myself to a point past exhaustion, because I know other people that have, and I've witnessed it. And
yeah, so you could argue in that sense, you've been more resilient than someone who hasn't had the capacity to actually have those healthy boundaries. They're going to have burnt out, and it's not because they're resilient and they've pushed themselves through things they shouldn't have done ultimately. So context is massive when we're on the topic of resilience, really.
Okay. And when we were talking before recording and show notes a little bit, you mentioned mental, emotional, and spiritual resilience as well. And maybe that's a bit of mental in that, okay, I can't, if I do this, this is going to happen, and I could push through it, and then I'm going to feel X, and I decide not to do it. Where I think in our culture, and, you know, you're in the UK, I'm from the States, I think that both of those are very similar in that type of boundary and that type of, we'll call it self-care, self-regulation of how much is on your plate isn't always looked at as the resilient choice, or the admirable choice, or the rewarded choice, or it tends to be the one that pushes themselves to do the 97 things instead of the 4 things, and then runs themselves into the ground. And, oh, that's so admirable how hard they work, or how tough they are, or how much grit they have, or, right? At least that's how I've seen it. And this is almost turning that on its head.
Yeah. So it's a really good point. I was speaking to Gavin Andrews yesterday, who's the managing director of HeartMath in the UK. And he actually doesn't really like the concept of resilience because it's often used, especially in a corporate setting, just to give people tools to be more productive. So he actually much prefers the concept of thriving. And you could use them interchangeably, but from my perspective, you're not a resilient person if you're not thriving. So even if you're doing superhuman things in your life, but you're struggling in some capacity and you've taken on too much, you've got great grit, but you're not resilient because ultimately there is a big mismatch somewhere there. And, that can come from all sorts of different underlying narratives around self-worth and self-love and all of these kinds of things as well. So yes, I think absolutely, you've got to put resiliency within the context of someone's values, how much balance there is in life, but how much balance they want in their life at that point in time. So there's a degree of self-awareness that has to be considered within this.
I love that. And the HeartMath people are great. I've interviewed Rollin a few times, and it's
amazing.
I always learn so much in those conversations that blows my mind. He always, we had this one study where, I don't know, insert mind-blowing statistics and numbers about HeartMath and about coherence. And I'll have to find Gavin and track him down and have another HeartMath person to talk with. And I like that he mentions that, because resilience, I think, at least in the common terminology, is similar to grit, or is similar to perseverance, or is similar to how many times can you get kicked in the shin and keep running up the hill sort of thing. And it's more, what you're talking about is more kind of setting yourself up to win and setting yourself up to feel good or taking care of yourself despite XYZ things happening outside of your control, or having life present itself with new baby, new work invitation or opportunity. Oh, there's this company that wants me to do this extra thing, or I got invited to speak at this thing that's 6 hours away, or this, and that all sounds like great stuff, right? And it's more of like being able to maintain your center and know what's good for you, and say no to things that maybe in the short term sound like good ideas, but then they cumulatively add up. So grit is not the type of resiliency that you're looking to describe here. And
exactly.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about, we have a pretty similar trajectory or background. Like, we started in the functional health world. You facilitate, I believe it's transformational breathwork. The breathwork I'm trained in is called biodynamic breathwork. So they're quite similar, but we'll just say breathwork as a thing, which I don't usually like to do because that's such a wide scope of often unrelated and very, very different things. But we'll talk about that as almost a side. The breath work, you've been through training at the Synthesis Institute with Psychedelics. And, a lot of the content you share on social media is more along the mental, emotional, spiritual side of things. And I think that in the last, especially, 3, 4, 5 years, this quote side, we'll call them sides, have been merged a little bit more than they used to be. And I'm curious, how'd you end up inching your way over towards what would be considered more the mental, emotional, spiritual side if you started more on the diet, nutrition, fitness, lifestyle, supplement side of things? How did that happen for you?
I think there's two things that come to mind straight away. One is we often do the things that we need. So I think I became more and more aware that there was just a gap in my own life from that perspective. Like, I was so going back about 8 years ago now, I was as in PubMed most days, researching presentations and learning about cellular pathways and all these kinds of things. And it was exciting. It was fun. It sometimes led to results with clients, but it also quite frequently didn't. And I stumbled across Michael Pollan's book. And I know this is such a cliche story because so many people have the same story, but I read his book, How to Change Your Mind. And I read that with absolutely no background knowledge around psychedelics. I knew nothing about the 60s, 70s. I knew nothing about what happens when you take psychedelics. And my mind was blown. And I just had this immediate desire. I was being pulled and drawn to wanting to inquire and explore that. And I think part of that was just because this whole new map had been opened up for me, but also there was a bit of a void in my life. I think ultimately, I do think I'd spent a lot of time not particularly connected with my body, not particularly connected with my emotional life and experience. And I had definitely been someone that had used grit and had been living in my head to get to where I was at that point in time. And it had been successful in a conventional, traditional sense, but it had come at an expense in regards to health and things like that to some degree as well. So in 2019, I headed off to a psychedelic retreat to explore and to learn and to experience. And it was there that I had my first ever breathwork session. And in some ways, the breathwork experience was more profound than the psychedelic experience because I really didn't have I had no expectation going into the breath session, where I had a little bit of an expectation, obviously, going into the psychedelic session. And I had quite a profound emotional release, I'll call it, in the breath work. And, to cut a long story short, I left that weekend knowing that I was going to train in breathwork and psychedelics because I saw how powerful a piece it could play within people's healing journeys, ultimately. And fast forwards to now, and we're talking about it.
Thank you for sharing. And I think you're right. I think that book was a gateway for a lot of people. My experience and background with psychedelics and knowledge about it, and it goes way back. And I did know a lot when that book came out, and I almost didn't read it for that reason. I was like, oh, this is like I don't need to read this book. And I did, mainly because I'd enjoyed his previous work. And so what I got out of it was that he approaches a topic that a lot of people are either intimidated by or confused by, or they think it's this thing. And he talks about it in a way that's very approachable for people like yourself who had no background, no knowledge, and had no experience. And to pique curiosity, not in an everybody needs to do this kind of way, but in a here it is, this is a rational look at it. If this seems like something that might be helpful to you, perhaps you might want to try it out kind of way, because I think a lot of stuff written about psychedelics before is almost evangelical in nature. And he was not. He was just, this is this. And the psychedelic community almost felt shorted by him because of like the way he wrote the book. Like, it wasn't evangelical. It wasn't everybody should do this. It wasn't this. And I think that was great, the way that it was written. So anybody out there, we'll put the link in the show notes, I'm sure, so you guys can check out that book too. And I love that the breath work was just as powerful for you. I could say the same, and I've had quite a bit of experience with both myself. And people don't realize that how potent intentional use of breath can be, which I think you mentioned just now that these things you wanted to learn to facilitate them because they can be really powerful in people's healing journeys. Are you speaking only of emotional healing then, or how do you see these tools?
I see them as tools that can be helpful, if we will call it, in the physical as well. And as you know, Michael, like, really there's no separation here anyway. They're totally and utterly interconnected at the end of the day. But I think so much of our what we could call physical health issues and complaints they often can come at least partly, if not solely, via emotional components and psycho-emotional components. So I think there were just some, profound realizations that I had in some of my first psychedelic journeys, whereby it became glaringly obvious how, as Michael Pollan will say, sort of rattling the snow globe is a way for us to just loosen the narrative that we have around who we are, our experiences, why we might be ill. And there's that opportunity afterwards to essentially, I think, come up with a new narrative. However, we also know in the research that these things have a physical impact. And, many psychedelics have an anti-inflammatory, immune modulating, somewhat antimicrobial property to them. So there is that kind of, I would call it, really small piece to it, which is they are potentially having that impact. I did a YouTube video 3 years ago on a paper that came out in 2019 that was essentially theorizing and discussing how psychedelics may help heal autoimmune diseases. And there are lots of different mechanisms that can be thought about as to how that might happen, some from sort of a psycho-emotional adverse childhood event perspective, but also some biological because of their anti-inflammatory properties as well. And people started reaching out to me and just, really briefly sharing their experiences with psychedelics and their autoimmune condition and things like this. And just last week, someone on the YouTube page said that DMT put their autoimmune disease into remission for many months. And we're not always going to be able to, if ever, really explain what's going on there. I think there's a mystery to it, which is part of the beauty, ultimately. And I definitely sit here now less interested in the science part of psychedelics and much more interested in, the stories and the meaning and the metaphors and the symbols and the symbolic language that are part of that healing process. And I think psychedelics and breathwork can really help some of us who are stuck in our heads drop into the body, drop into the heart, and actually just start to see things from a different perspective that I think can be really helpful when in the healing process. Because I was definitely attracting a lot of clients that were in their heads, hypervigilant, overanalyzing, overthinking, trying to heal through essentially restriction and supplementation. And I think I was finding that things like breathwork and psychedelics for me were a way that I was able to kind of expand my awareness and understanding of what matters for humans, what helps us thrive and what is needed for health, and how much does the energy medicine side of this actually sort of matter. So yeah, there was a kind of a period where I felt quite destabilized. Your whole paradigm kind of can dismantle once you start to experience these things. And I still feel like I'm integrating a lot of what came up ultimately and trying to figure out how can I sit in the middle of all of it? Because I definitely have been guilty of black and white thinking and being like, oh, it's all functional medicine, or actually everyone just needs somatic work and nervous system regulation work. Mm-hmm. And when I create enough space in my day and my life, I kind of always come back to the conclusion that it's all interconnected. And actually what we need is to be able to sit in the middle of all of these different parts, because that's what being human is all about ultimately.
I love the way that you're describing and talking about something that can be very difficult to put into words. And I'm sure it wasn't so smooth when you first started trying to explain it, because I came from a little bit different way of weaving it together. But when I got really into, because I'd already had that experience with psychedelics, but then when I got really into the functional medicine side of things and the protocols and the lab testing and I thought that I forgot about the other. And It was this, this was the way. And I just, at the time of recording this, I just spent the weekend in Romania with Gabor Mate and his organization, and there's a lot of crossover versus you're talking about this avatar of a person always in their head, hypervigilant, overanalyzing, always trying to figure out their sickness or their next step or their thing or their protocol or whatever. He talked quite a bit last weekend, and he does in his book, I believe in When the Body Says No, which was one of the first books ever written on this correlation between like that type of behavior patterns and ways of being. I don't want to call it like personality traits, because I think that those are just adaptive ways that we've learned how to handle things. So, and chronic disease. Like there are these avatars or types or patterns that are directly linked, and he can quote studies from not recently, like 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and there's loads of them saying like women with this predisposition to behave or act in this way or this pattern are X times more likely to develop breast cancer or rheumatoid arthritis or et cetera. And I think that, I don't know. Have you noticed since this shift for you, which now sounds like it was about 5 years ago, you're still working in functional medicine world. You're still working with a lot of practitioners. Have you seen, obviously this was really impactful for you and shifted your own resilience and well-being. And I'm curious, how much of this type of, the breath work or psychedelics, or just the emphasis on you mentioned getting out of your head and into your heart and your body. How has that impacted the way that you've either worked with clients or helped other practitioners work with clients? Like, what are you seeing? How are you seeing this show up in people's healing journeys?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the point that comes to mind is obviously, Michael, kind of meeting the client where they're at. So there are some clients where I just don't go there because I guess what I'm feeling speaking with them is that they're not really ready to go there. And there's no point, prodding someone ultimately. So there are some clients where I will still take a very functional medicine approach. I mean, I work with a lot of people with mold related illnesses where they've got sick from living in a water damaged property. They need a physical approach to dealing with that ultimately. And their objective, their goal might be to get back to a state of health that they had before going into that water damaged property. Whereas I might work with another client who, has a functional GI disorder where I do think the mind and our emotions play a significant role. And then that's a good example whereby we might start to open up the conversation around, okay, are you happy to share a little bit about what happened in your childhood? And are there any adverse childhood events there? And, there are certainly my intake forms have changed in regards to some of the questions that I've added to help have a slightly more holistic understanding of my clients and their journey. And I think, just how I explain things and I often like to share my thoughts and my perspective on health and healing. And going back to what you said, there is still this very understandable common scenario whereby people are trying to find the root cause. Functional medicine has told them there is a cause to why they have their autoimmune condition. And what I try and encourage people to consider is actually there isn't a cause. Your health condition is an accumulation of your life experience to this point in time. And you've just got to a point where you haven't had the resources to manage everything that is going on in your life up until this point. And if we shift the narrative to one that is it is more about building resilience, building health. So you've got the physiological resources to deal with whatever it is that is going on. And I just find that a more empowering, more liberating approach to it all, because if you're constantly trying to search for the root cause, I'm still trying to find a way to explain this better, but I guess from like an energetic perspective, you're searching for a problem, and let's face it, you're going to be able to find one with the functional lab tests that are out there. And because of the toxicity of our planet, if we go down the rabbit holes of, environmental toxins and heavy metals that we've all got from a body burden perspective these days. So for me, it's a more positive, empowering approach to the healing process. And I think when people understand that, often it is, some of the ways clients have described it is kind of, it's more expansive. The penny drops, and there's almost a reduction in their anxiety and their stress and their hypervigilance, because it's like, okay, I don't have to find this magic bullet anymore. I can actually focus on cultivating joy, gratitude, I can work at sitting in acceptance of where I am at this point in time rather than resisting where I am at this point in time. So there's that real energy component to this, I think, which is important, and I think is actually a prerequisite to the healing process. Because, you know, people listening, either maybe on their own health journey or practitioners working with certain clients, you know, when we're not accepting where we're at, when we're constantly fighting in sometimes desperation to get better, that is a barrier in its own right to getting better, in my experience. And that's where the mindset, the emotions, and using things like breath work as a way to get into the body and to feel some of the feelings that we might not be feeling is really powerful. And, you know, there's loads of research on that, you know, alexithymia, the condition whereby you've got reduced ability to identify and label your emotions. That's been associated with IBS, IBD, Hashimoto thyroiditis, fibromyalgia, among others. So we know, and obviously Gabor Mate has been probably the most well-known person to talk about this stuff. We know there's such an intimate connection between all of this. And I just, for me, and so many people, obviously, those sort of somatic practices have been a way to get out of the head, to create some space, to drop into the heart, and to just finally be able to actually see things from a slightly different perspective and feel things from a different perspective.
I think you explained that quite well. So I think you led with, I don't know how to talk about this, but that was really clear. I'm curious. I've never heard that term. How do you spell that?
Alexithymia.
Is it E-L?
It's A-L-E-X, I-T-H-Y-M-I-A. I think that's it. Alexithymia.
Inability to feel. Okay. That makes a ton of sense, because when you're talking, I love I kind of drew a line as you were talking in my notes, and one side is root cause, like paradigms, and the one side is root cause, remove, defend, avoid, deny, fighting, fear, frustration, and you will find a root cause. Like if you look for it, like you'll find, if you run enough lab tests. Like I had my first experience with nerve pain this year, which I don't wish on anyone, and now I have a much better understanding of it for the people who have had that problem. But I had a herniated disc in my C5-6 vertebrae, and my whole left side went into excruciating nerve pain for a while, and it was gnarly. And I went to I got an MRI done, and then I talked to, luckily I have a network of brilliant geniuses around the world who are very good at things. So I talked to my top guy that deals with things like that, and he said, well, how old are you? And I said 44. And he's like, did you play any sports or get any injuries? And I said, yes. He said, okay, if you ran an MRI on 144-year-old men who played a lot of sports and had a lot of injuries, and you ran a full spinal MRI on them, you're going to find some level of herniation of discs on pretty much all of them, but they don't have excruciating pain down their body, and they're not problematic or symptomatic. So what happened? What's going on? What happened? And the day before my pain started, I had an extraordinarily stressful situation come up and start. And the pain came in the middle of the night. Like I wasn't doing something. I didn't hurt it. I didn't pick up a thing. And anybody who throws out their back picking up a pillow can relate to this. It wasn't the pillow. And so I think that the same thing goes probably, and I don't know this for sure, I might be projecting here, but with functional medicine lab testing, you run a few $1,000s in functional lab tests and you're looking at all those things, you're going to find toxins in the body. You're going to find some deficiencies of vitamins or minerals. You're going to find some immune markers that are probably off. You'll find some weird stuff in somebody's stool test that probably shouldn't be at the level that it is. And you could run all that on like them who have all these symptoms, and you could run it on their neighbor who doesn't currently have symptoms. And I have a feeling that those tests would often be kind of indecipherable at some point between the person who's sick and the person who's not. And then mold, I mean, there's extreme, like mold exposure is a thing, and it's a real thing, and it does cause problems, and you can find it on a lab test. So like, I'm not trying to throw all of it out. No. But I mean, does that make sense? Like, do you agree with that kind of?
Total sense. We've got studies showing it. It's the same with like brain function. There's no direct correlation between brain pathology and cognitive function. So there can be people who have more brain pathology, but actually have higher cognitive function. There can be people with less brain pathology who have Alzheimer's disease. So there's no direct correlation there. And that's why I love the concept of like resiliency and thriving and taking this much more broader holistic perspective, because it's kind of what we understand in the research at the end of the day. There's no direct correlation there. Like, you'll have people walking down the high street with positive mycotoxin tests, positive heavy metal tests, dysbiosis, leaky guts, etc., but they may be, relatively healthy and asymptomatic. So what else is going on there? How can we explain why some people are experiencing debilitating symptoms when they have sometimes less dysfunction than someone else? That's the part, I think, the mystery of being human. But stress, our emotions, our overall energetic states, how we relate to life, these things just go so deep. And one of the most common things I talk about with clients is, none of this is black and white. And therefore, actually, we have to get comfortable sitting in the gray. And part of the healing process, the true healing process, is your capacity to sit in the gray with the unknown, with the uncertainty. And the more comfortable you can be there, essentially, the more resilient you are going to be anyway. Yeah.
I can feel people getting a little anxious just even thinking about not being in the certainty and being in the gray. And that's a trauma response too. Like, that's a thing of myself that I've had to do a lot of work around, that I realized, and I didn't see myself in that way. And then I started to learn a lot of these things, and I was like, oh, I do that. I am that. Like, I need to have everything be, you mentioned the hypervigilance and all these on that side. But it's more what you're saying is building. You mentioned cultivating joy, gratitude, acceptance, and then that goes into quality food and lower stress levels and better sleep. And it's more of the, I don't remember who I interviewed years ago, but they talked about how, when they're working with somebody on dietary changes, they like to focus a lot more with the individual on what they should eat more of than the list of things that they're not allowed to look at or touch or whatever. Because if they add in way more of this stuff, they're going to by default eat less of that stuff, because there's a finite amount of eating and these things are filling. And if you have a plate full of colorful vegetables, you're probably not going to eat this, and this. And it blew my mind during the interview, because I'd never looked at it that way. And I was always the don't eat these things coach. And then it was like, wow. And it can go that way for, it really, when you were describing the two sides of how to approach this and how you find one to be more effective, one side is more about adding, whether it's better nutrition or better care of yourself, or and the other side is more about avoidance and subtraction and fear. And I really think there's a physiological reaction to those, and that's been demonstrated as well. All this woo-woo stuff, if we really wanted to, we could be throwing a ton of citations out there, and it exists, and people have written the books, and I'm sure Alex has read a lot of the studies. So I don't know. I don't know if that was a question or a rant or just how I interpreted what they taught. And I love that it's that flip, because there's this profile of the person who's afraid of the things and avoiding the things and looking at it as like a battle or a war against this thing or a defeat this disease, or the language even around that. And I can't have this. I can't be around that. I can't go here. I can't, versus, my pain was a little bit less today than it was yesterday, or I was able to do this thing that I couldn't do, or,
yeah. And I think, what came up for me as you shared all of that was, a big thing is our capacity to create a little bit of distance between us and our symptoms, and, holding those symptoms lighter, more gently. So you can, what are we talking about with all of that? We're kind of, that's a common sort of saying within the world of meditation and mindfulness, ultimately, isn't it? This idea of distance and having a bit of time to respond rather than react to the experience that we're having, and these kind of things. And ultimately, it goes so deep into our psyche, our experiences, our upbringing, the belief systems that we essentially maybe inherited, or essentially certainly picked up in our childhood. And some of those defense mechanisms of, I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't go there, I can't eat that, they're all obviously legitimate. That person really can't do those things without a flare in symptoms. However, the underlying mechanism and understanding of why they can't is different when we take these two different approaches. And that's where, for me, making the distance between you and the symptom through whatever strategy that might be and whatever intervention can help us with our self-awareness and help us understand. But the hard thing as the practitioner, Michael, as you kind of know, is meeting them where they're at and taking that polyvagal approach of, we've got to help them feel as safe as possible, ultimately. And sometimes that means supporting them down the path that they want to go down a little bit, while also trying to make sure we're not taking them all the way down the rabbit hole, because we know that actually they're in the wrong rabbit hole. So it's a real skill and an ability for a practitioner to be able to kind of appreciate that it's not about them. You've got to put it on the client, where they're at, where they want to go, honor that, and try and be a little bit of a bridge between where they want to go and where you feel they might need to go. But they're never going to be able to go there if they don't feel safe. And that's where I'm a huge fan of the whole polyvagal theory. And just that therapeutic relationship, ultimately.
I love that. And I love that for the practitioners out there to hear, because I think and I was guilty of this when I haven't worked one-on-one with people in health world in a while, but I definitely was one who would try to get them to go where I thought they should go in now. And regardless of where they were coming from, kind of. And whether that was more elaborate protocols, or whether I didn't know a lot of the stuff I know now then, so I didn't teach the same things and I didn't have the same perspective. But that could even apply just to functional medicine world, where it's giving them 106 new things to do by next Thursday instead of 3. And not even the safety. I've seen things now that, because that feeling of safety that you're talking about and security of being seen and understood by the practitioner and having somebody in your corner, and that belief that we can do this together. I've seen that in cases very close to me. My wife has been through really horrific autoimmune flares in the last 5 years. And we switched doctors. Shout to Dr. Eric Gordon, who's coming on the show, but that's my wife's doctor. And the first time we met with him, he understood where she was at, and he saw her, and he talked to her for 2 hours. And the first action he took was writing the official note in the state of California so she could have 8 weeks out of the ER. She's an ER nurse during COVID, to get 8 weeks off work, to get disability, to get leave, where she knew she was going to get a break from the chaos that was going on and whatever. And the next day, she hadn't had one of those days off yet. She hadn't even missed a scheduled day of work. She hadn't started any of the stuff that we talked to him about doing. And her pain was at least 50% less than it was the day before. Wow. And we hadn't even done anything yet. It was just knowing that a break was coming. It was having somebody that she felt saw her and understood her. And there was a confidence that we're going to be able to, I could get better. But we hadn't done a thing, not one thing. And when I saw that, I was like, wow, because we had tried 10 million things and that didn't work. So maybe we should look at that a little bit more, that side. And that's what you're talking about here, is that safety rippled through her system, and you turn off the danger alerts for a minute. And it's incredible what happens in the, at the cellular level and the physiological level, right?
Yeah. And, the functional medicine brain kicks in, and you start thinking, things like cell danger response, all of that stuff that's out there. And there's an overlap between all of these different concepts. Ultimately, it's just kind of different. It's a different map. It's a different language, but actually they all interconnect. And they're just different ways of explaining similar things ultimately. And that's why I think, again, we need more people sitting in the middle who can be able to talk about the cell danger response and polyvagal theory and how actually they're interconnected. So yeah.
I think you're doing a great job of sitting there in the middle. So, and you're doing a lot of work with practitioners too. That's what I love when I see people who I think really get this, like understand that there's no side to this. Like there's no sides. I would do interviews as the one being interviewed and talk about a perspective from both sides of healing. And we'd use this term like sides. Once I started studying the mental, emotional, trauma, energy you mentioned, which we didn't get too into, but psychedelics, breathwork, and then there's the diet and the supplements and the exercise and the protocols and the lab tests. I would even use the term sides. And I think now it's really about blurring the lines between, like there are no sides. And I think we've both kind of come to that conclusion, but how to move the needle forward as a whole, like with all the practitioners out there really being able to do this. So I guess I'm going to ask now just the last question, if there's patients out there, if there's people out there who are looking for health optimization and maybe they've kind of run into a wall a little bit, or they've backtracked, or they've kind of caught themselves on a symptom treadmill, or whatever they're struggling with, and they've done the diets, they've done the supplements, they've done the protocols, they know their root causes, they found them on the lab test, they have a great practitioner, they're doing all these things, and they've gotten marginally better. Maybe some of the symptoms are less, or they come and go versus being all the time. And they hear us talk about all this weird stuff, and they're interested in kind of putting the foot in the water, whether it's breath work or psychedelics or trauma work or nervous system, anything you mentioned. Where would you recommend people start, or how to kind of make that jump or leap?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's what I want to say is a matter of just starting. And, we're all going to be at different points there. That might be that you need to start following different people on your social media, for example, and find some breath workers that you resonate with. Find a nervous system regulating facilitator, so to speak, that you resonate with. Read some books, listen to some podcasts, like start broadening your horizon around what influences our health. Spend more time relating and experiencing your body. Spend more time in nature. Try and create more space physically in your life so you can allow your innate wisdom to come up at the same time. And I think there's got to be that balance between looking for the wisdom of others who have been down the path and can share their experiences, their knowledge, but also actually and fundamentally, we need to create as much as we can within the context of our lives, the space for that innate healing intelligence to come up for us. Because, what is the functional medicine saying? Treat the individual, not the disease. So we have to whatever capacity we can, trust that our body has the intelligence and the wisdom it needs, and is that naturopathic principle of it is a self-organizing, self-healing organism in the right environment. You cut your finger is the thing everyone says, and you don't doubt that it's going to heal. So if we're not healing on a systemic level, one, we're in the wrong environment. And that can be everything from our thoughts, our emotions, to relationships, to diets, to the air we're breathing, and everything. And also, I want to acknowledge that there's a whole area that very rarely gets talked about, which is things like socioeconomic status and culture and our society at large. We're not able to heal fully in isolation. And that is what most of us certainly in the Western world try and do. It's like us on a healing journey, trying to kind of figure it all out. And, we are social creatures, and we need a tribe, we need a community, we need connection, we need physical touch. And one of the things I think we need more of in that sort of whole space is we need to learn to basically parent ourselves again. A lot of us, we need to be gentle with ourselves. We need to have more compassion. We need to nurture and nourish ourselves rather than punishing ourselves sometimes by what is the next restrictive diet that I need to do, or what is the next £200 in supplements that I need to spend on. Like, that is not a healing energy mentality approach ultimately. So we need people, we need educators, we need to broaden our horizons, we need more space in our lives. We need to be more patient. We might need to be more accepting of where we're at. And then, dipping toe in, different ways to do it. You could find a breathwork organization. Some of them on their websites, like Transformational Breath, you'll be able to put in your postcode. You'll be able to find the local facilitator, and you could reach out to them. There are apps now for breathwork, some really good ones, where the facilitator will take you through a 5-minute body scan or a 5-minute breathing coherent practice. There's institutions like HeartMath who have biofeedback devices that we can use to actually see in real time how coherent, how resilient are we. I actually say to a lot of people, if you don't have experience with psychedelics, start with conscious connected breathwork and find a reputable practitioner, because what comes up in those breathwork sessions, I think, is some of the best preparation we can do for going into a psychedelic ceremony. And my thoughts on psychedelics have changed quite a lot over the last 5 years, in the sense that one of my concerns is most of us aren't in an environment to get the most out of psychedelics. We're not in community post psychedelic experience. We go back to our 9 to 5 in probably a relatively isolated existence. And it's just so easy to fall back into our own patterns. So I think there's a lot of preparation that has to go into that. That's my waffle, Michael, on
it was great, and I love that you brought up some things that we didn't get a chance to touch on in the conversation that are important, like socioeconomic status, and like if somebody's in a unsafe life environment, whether that's not knowing if they're going to have a home or have food or be able to pay bills, or you're in a dangerous, physically dangerous situation, it's going to be very, very difficult to find healing in that environment. And that you mentioned we don't heal in isolation. And I think that isn't talked about enough at all in the functional medicine world or space, that what our culture of rugged individualism and the absence of community and connection has on people on a physiological level, and that we're not wired for that. And I agree that certain styles of breathwork are definitely, if somebody's interested in exploring altered states or psychedelics, that it's a really good kind of primer with the right teacher and the right organization and the right style of breathing. And that even simple breathing, which you mentioned, some apps where they'll take them through a 5-minute just breathing practice. Because even we're talking about breathwork as a conscious practice to kind of alter your state and physiology. There's also the fact that most of us breathe physiologically incorrectly, which causes a lot of problems to begin with. And just learning how to breathe, which is different than what we're talking about, is another great thing as well. I've interviewed Patrick McKeown a few times from Buteco and Oxygen Advantage, and I know he has a good app that teaches you physiologically how to breathe. And people don't even know that we're like the thing we do the most that gives us, literally makes us alive, we're doing incorrectly and dysfunctionally. So I think there's a million nuggets there at the end that people can kind of take and run with, and creating the space. I love the mention of that. And so if somebody wants to learn more about you and the work that you're doing, both for practitioners and individuals, where would they want to go?
Best place is just my website, which is alexmanos.co.uk. And you'll find various links there to blog articles, to my resiliency program, to some of the functional testing that I still do run from time to time, among other things. So that's the best website for sure.
Great. And on Instagram, what's your Instagram handle, just for people listening?
Instagram handle is Alexander Manos.
Okay. And you share great stuff there. That's where I actually found you a few years ago and was like, I need to have this guy on the show, because I just resonate a lot with what you share. So there's great content there for those of you that are on Instagram. Speaking of new people to follow. And I hope that there was enough here that you can kind of recalibrate your direction when it comes to a healing journey. So Alex, thank you so much for the time, for sharing so much of your knowledge and the experience and what you've kind of learned on your own journey and how that's impacting how you're helping people on theirs. So thank you so much.
No, thank you for the opportunity.